If you've ever stood in front of your avocado tree wondering whether you should cut it back or just leave it alone, you're not the only one. Avocados can be tricky because unlike a lot of fruit trees, they don't follow the same pruning rules you might be used to. Prune too much, and you can actually hurt your harvest. Prune too little, and you end up with a massive tree that's impossible to pick from. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete process of pruning avocado trees for maximum yield and plant health, whether you have a young tree you're just shaping or an older tree that's gotten out of control. Plus, stick around to the end where I'll show you a simple technique that can actually encourage your tree to produce fruit faster. Let's get into it. Avocado trees are one of the most rewarding fruit trees you can grow in your backyard, but they're also one of the most misunderstood when it comes to pruning. A lot of people either ignore them completely or hack them back like they would an apple tree, and both approaches can cost you fruit. The good news is that once you understand how avocados grow and why we prune them, everything starts to make a lot more sense. So before we pick up any tools, let's talk about what's actually happening inside your tree. The first thing you need to understand about avocado trees is why we prune them in the first place. And honestly, you don't have to prune an avocado tree. It will grow and produce fruit without you ever touching it. But here's the problem. Avocado trees are what I call enthusiastic growers. Left to their own devices, they'll shoot up to 30 or 40 feet tall, and all of your fruit ends up way out of reach. I've seen backyard avocados where the homeowner needs a 20-foot ladder just to harvest, and that's not practical or safe for most of us. Beyond height control, there are some real benefits to thoughtful pruning. First, you improve light penetration. Avocado fruit develops on the outer canopy, where the sunlight hits, so if your tree is a dense tangle of branches, you're actually limiting how much fruit it can produce. Think of it like a factory with workers who can't see what they're doing. They're not going to be very productive. By opening up the canopy, you're letting light reach more of those fruiting zones. Second, you improve airflow. Avocados can be susceptible to fungal diseases, especially in humid climates. When air can't circulate through the tree, moisture sits on the leaves and creates perfect conditions for problems like anthracnose and phytophthora. Good pruning opens things up and helps keep your tree healthy. Third, and this is the big one for most backyard growers, you keep the tree at a manageable size. I grow avocados in Zone 10, and I keep mine around 12 to 15 feet tall. That means I can harvest most of my fruit from a 6-foot ladder, which makes the whole process a lot more enjoyable. Now, avocados grow differently than a lot of other fruit trees, and this affects how we approach pruning. They produce fruit on new growth, which means the branches that grew this year are the ones that will flower and fruit next year. This is really important to understand, because if you prune too aggressively and remove all of that new growth, you've just cut off next year's harvest. It's a balance. You want to shape the tree and control its size, but you don't want to go overboard. Avocados also have what's called apical dominance, which is just a fancy way of saying the top of the tree wants to be the boss. The highest point on the tree gets the most energy and grows the fastest. That's why avocados naturally want to shoot straight up. When we prune, we can use this to our advantage by cutting back the top and redirecting that energy into lateral branches, which gives us a wider, more productive tree instead of a tall, skinny one. Let's talk about tools and timing, because both of these matter more than you might think. For tools, you'll need 3 things. First, a good pair of bypass pruning shears for small branches up to about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Bypass shears make a clean cut, which is important for tree health. Anvil pruners crush the branch and can cause damage, so stick with bypass. Second, you'll need loppers for branches between 3/4 of an inch and about 2 inches. And third, a pruning saw for anything larger than 2 inches. One thing I cannot stress enough is keeping your tools clean and sharp. A dull blade tears the wood instead of cutting it cleanly. and that torn tissue is an open invitation for disease. Before I prune any tree, I wipe down my blades with rubbing alcohol or a 10% bleach solution. This is especially important if you're moving between trees, because you don't want to spread any pathogens from one tree to another. I keep a spray bottle of rubbing alcohol right in my pruning bucket. For this reason. Now timing. When should you prune your avocado tree? The best time is late winter to early spring, after any danger of frost has passed, but before the spring growth flush begins. In my Zone 10 climate, that's usually February or early March. If you're in Zone 9, you might wait until late March. The idea is to prune when the tree is still somewhat dormant but about to wake up. This gives the tree the entire growing season to heal those pruning cuts and put on new growth. You want to avoid pruning in late summer or fall. Here's why. When you make a pruning cut, the tree responds by pushing out new growth near that cut. If you prune in September, you'll stimulate tender new growth that won't have time to harden off before winter. In areas that get any frost at all, that new growth can be damaged or killed. Even in mild climates, late pruning can interfere with the flowering cycle. There's one exception to this timing rule. If you have dead, diseased, or damaged branches, you should remove those whenever you notice them, regardless of the season. Dead wood doesn't benefit from waiting, and diseased branches can spread problems to the rest of the tree. So if you see something obviously wrong, take it out. Let's move on to shaping young trees, because this is where you really set yourself up for success. If you have a tree that's less than 3 years old, your pruning approach is all about establishing good structure. You're not worried about fruit production yet. You're building the framework that will support decades of harvests. When you first plant an avocado tree, it usually comes from the nursery as a single whip, which is just one straight trunk with maybe a few small branches. Your first pruning decision happens when that tree reaches about 3 to 4 feet tall. At that point, you want to cut the main trunk back to encourage branching. I know this feels wrong. You just waited for this tree to grow, and now I'm telling you to cut it. But trust me on this. Take your pruning shears and cut the main trunk at about 3 feet high, just above a leaf node. A leaf node is where a leaf attaches to the stem, and there are dormant buds at each node that will activate once you remove the top. Within a few weeks, you'll see several new shoots emerge below your cut. These are going to become your main scaffold branches. Now, you don't want all of those shoots. You want to select 3 to 5 of the strongest ones that are evenly spaced around the trunk. Think of it like the spokes on a wheel. You want them pointing in different directions so the tree develops a balanced, open shape. Any shoots that are growing straight up, crossing over other branches, or pointing toward the center of the tree should be removed. During the first few years, your job is to keep encouraging this outward spreading growth pattern. Every time a branch gets about 2 feet long, you can tip it back by cutting off the last 6 to 8 inches. This encourages that branch to split into 2 or 3 new branches, which fills out the canopy. I usually do this light tipping 2 or 3 times during the growing season on young trees. One mistake I see a lot of people make is letting one branch become dominant. Avocados will naturally try to send one shoot straight up to become the new leader. If you let this happen, you'll end up right back where you started with a tall, narrow tree. Whenever you see a vertical shoot trying to take over, either remove it completely or cut it back hard to redirect the energy into horizontal growth. By the end of year 3, your tree should have a nice vase shape or open center with 3 to 5 main scaffold branches, spreading outward and upward at about a 45-degree angle. This structure allows light to penetrate into the center of the tree and gives you a manageable framework to work with for years to come. I've found that the time you invest in shaping a young tree pays off enormously later on. A well-structured tree is easier to maintain, easier to harvest, and more productive than one that was allowed to grow wild in those early years. Now let's talk about maintaining mature trees, which is what most of you are probably dealing with. Once your tree is established and producing fruit, your annual pruning shifts from shaping to maintenance. The goals are keeping the tree at a manageable height, maintaining good light penetration, removing problem branches, and encouraging new fruiting wood. I like to approach mature tree pruning in 3 passes. First, I walk around the tree and look for the obvious stuff. Dead branches, anything that's diseased or damaged, branches that are crossing and rubbing against each other. These all come out first, because they're not contributing to the tree and they can actually cause problems. Dead wood harbors pests and disease. Crossing branches create wounds where they rub together, and those wounds are entry points for infection. Second pass is looking at the overall size and shape. Has the tree gotten taller than you want? Are there branches reaching out too far horizontally and getting in the way of walkways or other plants? This is where you make your size control cuts. I'll talk more about height management in a few minutes because that's a topic that deserves its own attention. Third pass is the detail work. This is where you step back, look at the density of the canopy, and decide if you need to thin anything out to improve light and airflow. You're looking at the interior of the tree now, checking for branches that are shaded out and not producing, or areas where the growth is so thick that air can't move through. When you make your cuts on a mature tree, you have 2 main options: heading cuts and thinning cuts. A heading cut is when you cut a branch back to a shorter length, leaving a stub. This stimulates growth near the cut and is useful when you want the tree to fill in or branch out in a certain area. A thinning cut is when you remove a branch entirely, cutting it back to where it connects to a larger branch or the trunk. This opens up the tree without stimulating a bunch of new growth at that spot. For maintenance pruning on mature avocados, I use mostly thinning cuts. The reason is that heading cuts can trigger a flush of vigorous vertical shoots called water sprouts, and those are exactly what you don't want. Water sprouts grow straight up, they're not productive, and they create density problems. If you find yourself constantly fighting water sprouts, you're probably making too many heading cuts. Here's something that took me a few years to learn. You don't have to prune a lot every year. In fact, moderate annual pruning is much better for your tree than neglecting it for several years and then doing a major renovation. I aim to remove no more than 15 to 20% of the canopy in any given year. If you take off more than that, you stress the tree, and you'll likely trigger an explosion of water sprouts as the tree tries to replace what it lost. Slow and steady wins the race with avocado pruning. Now let's get into thinning for light penetration and airflow, because this is really where you can make a difference in your fruit production. Remember what I said earlier about avocados producing fruit on the outer canopy where sunlight hits? Well, if your tree is so dense that light can't get into the interior, you're limiting your potential harvest to just the very outside of the tree. By thinning strategically, you can increase the productive area significantly. Stand under your tree and look up. Can you see patches of sky through the canopy? You should be able to. If it's a solid mass of leaves with no light coming through, the interior of that tree is essentially dead space. The leaves in there are shaded out, they're not photosynthesizing efficiently, and they're definitely not going to produce fruit. They're like those unproductive workers I mentioned earlier. Time to let them go. When you thin for light, you're looking for branches that are growing into the center of the tree. Branches that are layered directly on top of each other, creating shade, and older branches in the interior that aren't getting any sun. Start by removing the obvious offenders, the branches that are clearly in the wrong place. Then step back and look again. You'll often see more opportunities once you've made those first few cuts. One technique I use is called window pruning. You're essentially creating windows or openings in the canopy that allow light to penetrate deeper into the tree. Instead of removing branches uniformly all over, you select specific spots where opening a window will do the most good. Usually this means removing a branch or two on the south side of the tree, where the sun exposure is strongest. That light will then reach branches that were previously shaded. Airflow works on the same principle. You want air to be able to move through the tree, not around it. A dense, unpruned avocado acts like a wall. Wind hits it and goes around. But an open, well-thinned tree allows air to flow through the canopy, which keeps leaves dry and reduces disease pressure. In humid climates or areas with summer rain, this is especially important. I've seen trees side by side where one was pruned properly and one wasn't, and the difference in disease incidence was dramatic. When you're thinning, always cut back to a lateral branch or the trunk. Don't leave stubs. Stubs don't heal properly, and they invite decay and disease into the tree. Make your cut just outside the branch collar, which is that slightly swollen area where the branch connects to the larger limb. The branch collar contains specialized tissue that helps the tree seal over the wound, so you want to preserve it. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos on fruit tree care. All right, let's keep going. Let's talk about what to do when you have an old or neglected tree that needs some serious help. Maybe you moved into a house with an existing avocado that hasn't been pruned in years. Maybe you inherited grandma's tree and it's now 30 feet tall. This is one of the most common situations I hear about, and the good news is that avocados respond well to renovation pruning. The bad news is that it takes patience. The biggest mistake people make with neglected trees is trying to fix everything in 1 year. They look at this massive, overgrown tree and think, I'm just going to cut it way back and start over. Please don't do this. Removing more than about 20 to 25% of the canopy in a single year will send your tree into shock. You'll get massive water sprout growth, you'll lose fruit production for several years, and you might even kill the tree if it's already stressed. Instead, think of renovation pruning as a 3-year project. In year 1, your goal is to bring the height down to something more manageable and remove the worst of the dead, diseased, and crossing branches. If the tree is 30 feet tall and you want it at 15 feet, don't cut it to 15 feet this year. Cut it to maybe 22 or 23 feet. You're taking about 1/4 of the height off, which is about all the tree can handle gracefully. Make your height reduction cuts strategically. Don't just flat top the tree like you're giving it a bad haircut. Instead, identify the tallest branches and cut each one back to a lateral branch that's pointing in the direction you want growth to continue. This is called drop crotching, and it gives you a more natural-looking result that heals better than a flat top cut. In year 2, you'll bring the height down another step and start working on opening up the canopy. By now, the tree has recovered from last year's pruning and put on some new growth. You can take it down another 5 feet or so and begin removing some of the interior branches that are shading things out. You'll also need to deal with any water sprouts that emerge from last year's cuts. Some of these can be removed entirely, and a few can be trained into useful branches if they're in good positions. By year 3, you should be close to your target height. Now you're fine-tuning the shape, continuing to thin for light penetration, and transitioning into maintenance mode. From this point forward, you're just doing your annual maintenance pruning to keep things in check. I renovated an old Hass avocado in my yard using this method, and it took 3 years to get it where I wanted. But the tree never skipped a beat on fruit production. Every year it gave me avocados while I was gradually reshaping it. If I had tried to do it all at once, I would have lost at least 2 or 3 years of harvests while the tree recovered. Patience really does pay off. Now, height management deserves special attention because it's probably the #1 pruning challenge for backyard avocado growers. These trees want to be tall. It's in their nature. And keeping them at a manageable height requires consistent attention year after year. The key to height management is understanding that you can't just cut the top off once and expect it to stay short. When you remove the top of an avocado tree, you take away its apical dominance, that top point that was suppressing growth below. Suddenly, all those suppressed buds wake up and start growing, and several of them will try to become the new leader. If you don't stay on top of this, within a year or two, you'll have multiple vertical shoots that have grown right back to where you started, or even taller. Here's my approach to keeping avocados at a reasonable height. First, decide what your target height is and stick with it. For most backyard growers, somewhere between 12 and 18 feet is practical. This lets you harvest most fruit from a standard orchard ladder without needing bucket trucks or professional help. Every year during your main pruning session, identify any branches that have exceeded your target height and cut them back, using the drop crotch method I mentioned. You're not flat topping, you're selectively lowering the tallest points. Throughout the growing season, keep an eye on vigorous vertical shoots. If you see one racing upward, you can pinch it back or remove it while it's still small. This is much easier than waiting until it's a thick branch that requires a saw. Some growers use a technique called stumping, where they cut major scaffold branches back very hard to force the tree into a more compact form. This works, but it's aggressive, and you'll lose significant production for a year or two while the tree regrows. I prefer the gradual approach of consistent annual pruning combined with summer shoot management. It keeps the tree productive while maintaining control of the size. One more thing about height. Where you make your cut matters for what happens next. If you cut a vertical branch straight across, the buds just below that cut will grow straight up as new vertical shoots. But if you cut back to a lateral branch that's pointing outward, growth will tend to continue in that outward direction. Always try to direct the energy horizontally rather than vertically, and you'll spend less time fighting the tree's natural tendencies. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into and how to solve them. First, water sprouts. If your tree is producing a ton of these vigorous vertical shoots, it's usually a response to over-pruning or to topping cuts. The tree is trying to replace the canopy it lost. The solution is twofold. Remove most of the water sprouts while they're still young and easy to handle, but also back off on how much you're removing each year. Give the tree time to stabilize. Going forward, focus on thinning cuts rather than heading cuts, and you'll see fewer water sprouts. Second, sunburned bark. Avocado bark is thin and sensitive to direct sunlight. If you dramatically open up the canopy or remove large branches, you can expose bark that's never seen direct sun before. That bark can get sunburned, which shows up as cracking, peeling, or discolored patches. To prevent this, don't remove too much canopy at once. And if you do need to expose a major limb, you can paint it with diluted white latex paint to reflect sunlight. Mix the paint 50-50 with water and brush it on the exposed bark. Third, slow healing of large cuts. Avocados don't seal over wounds as quickly as some other fruit trees. A large pruning cut can take several years to fully close over, and during that time it's vulnerable to decay and boring insects. To minimize this risk, avoid making cuts larger than about 4 inches in diameter if possible. When you do have to make a big cut, make sure it's clean and smooth. Some growers apply a pruning sealer, but honestly, the research on whether sealers help or hurt is mixed. I generally leave cuts open and let them heal naturally, and I've had good results. Fourth, branches dying back after pruning. Sometimes you'll make a pruning cut and the branch will die back beyond where you cut. Sometimes several inches or even a foot past your cut line. This is usually caused by one of two things. Either the cut was made during wet weather and a fungal infection got into the wound, or the branch was already stressed or declining and didn't have the energy to heal. To prevent this, always prune during dry weather. Sterilize your tools between cuts if you suspect disease, and make sure you're cutting back to healthy, vigorous wood. If you see any discoloration or soft spots in the wood when you cut, move further down the branch until you reach clean, white tissue. Fifth, the tree not fruiting after pruning. This is a common concern, and it's almost always because too much was removed at once. Remember, avocados fruit on new growth, so if you cut off all the branches that were going to flower next season, you've eliminated your crop. The other possibility is timing. If you pruned late in the season and the tree put its energy into regrowing rather than flowering, you might skip a year. The fix is simple. Be more conservative with how much you remove and stick to late winter or early spring for your main pruning. Sixth, uneven regrowth. Sometimes after pruning, the tree will grow back lopsided, with one side much more vigorous than the other. This usually happens when one part of the tree is getting more sun or is healthier than another part. To correct this, you can prune the vigorous side a bit harder to slow it down and leave more growth on the weak side to help it catch up. Also check whether there's something inhibiting the weak side, like root competition, shade from a structure, or poor drainage on that side of the tree. The good news is, if you follow the steps we've covered, you should be able to avoid most of these issues. Avocados are actually pretty forgiving trees. They respond well to pruning, and they have an amazing ability to bounce back from mistakes, so don't be afraid to make cuts. Just be thoughtful about it and don't overdo it in any single year. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something that can actually encourage your tree to produce fruit sooner, and it's called scoring or girdling. Now before I explain this, I want to be clear that this is an advanced technique, and you should only try it on a healthy, established tree. Don't do this on a young tree, or one that's already stressed. Here's how it works. Avocado trees, like many fruit trees, have to balance their energy between vegetative growth and reproductive growth. A very vigorous tree that's putting all its energy into growing branches and leaves may be reluctant to flower and fruit. Scoring is a way to interrupt that pattern and convince the tree it's time to reproduce. In late fall or early winter, before the tree flowers, you take a sharp knife and make a shallow cut around the trunk or a major scaffold branch. You're cutting through the bark and just into the cambium layer, the thin green tissue right under the bark. You're not cutting into the wood itself. The cut should go about 3/4 of the way around the trunk or branch, not all the way around. If you go all the way around, you'll girdle the tree completely and it could die. What this does is temporarily interrupt the flow of carbohydrates from the leaves down to the roots. Those carbohydrates build up above the cut, and the tree interprets this as a signal to put energy into flowering rather than more vegetative growth. It's like a gentle wake-up call that says, hey, it's time to make some fruit. I've used this technique on a tree that was 5 years old and had never flowered. The following spring after scoring, it set its first fruit. Now, I'm not saying it works every time, and you have to be careful not to cut too deep or go all the way around. But for a healthy tree that just seems reluctant to produce, it's worth trying. The cut will heal over within a few months, and the tree won't be permanently damaged. One variation is to score individual branches rather than the main trunk. This is less risky because even if something goes wrong, you've only affected one branch. You can experiment on a single scaffold branch and see how the tree responds before doing more. So that's everything you need to know about pruning avocado trees for maximum yield and plant health. We covered why we prune, how to shape young trees for success, how to maintain mature trees year after year, how to renovate old neglected trees without shocking them, and how to keep your tree at a height where you can actually reach the fruit. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And if you have any questions about your avocado tree or tips of your own that have worked well, drop them in the comments below. I love hearing what's working in your garden. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your avocados.